Hello, lovely learners. Welcome back to ALifeLearned. Today I'm going to be fulfilling a request I got on Instagram a while ago to discuss the realities of debt and budgeting for the impoverished or anyone living under the poverty line. So I'll basically be discussing it in the matter of Canadians, though I would think that it's probably very similar no matter where you go in the world. And ultimately, debt is inevitable and budgeting is impossible. And I don't mean to simplify it so much, but that is one way that you could say too long, didn't want to read. Yeah, that's how it is. In the sense that a lot of credit cards and banks and things that create, or business, you could say, create their economy over debt and lending, they are actually predatorial and they look for people who, like, they won't lend to people that won't pay back, but they will happily lend and give more and more credit to people who can't reasonably pay it off but constantly pay the minimums. And in paying the minimums end up paying just astronomical amounts in interest. And so if someone who's impoverished manages to find themselves in a situation of having any level of credit, whether it's an overdraft or a credit card, or a line of credit or a loan or anything like that, it's a very good chance that they're going to find themselves in a really difficult situation when it comes to trying to pay it back, because they're poor. The idea is that they're already under the poverty line, they're already struggling to meet their basic needs, and they're probably, because of that, going to end up using this extra credit to help afford those basic needs. How do you pay it back when you didn't have it to begin with? So unfortunately that does lead to a lot of defaults on loans, and that's something that contributed quite a bit to the housing bubble of 2008, actually, was banks deliberately loaning to people that did not have the income to pay it back, really way too easily. And then it all just like blowing up as people couldn't pay their loans. And I'm not saying, again, that banks will just willy-nilly loan to anyone. You do have to have some sign of either no credit, where they will start you off and give you a chance, or at least some sign that you don't default on paying your bills. So in my case, I have quite a bit of credit because I've paid off a lot of things using my student loans in the past, basically, before I was on assistance, or I should say in between some of the times that I was on assistance. But I found myself in this situation of trying to afford my basic needs, not having enough provided to me by assistance, so leaning on my credit and then trying to pay it back with my student loans, but now I'm not allowed to accept nearly as much of my loans. Like OSAP, though they give a lot less these days as well, the Ontario Student, whatever it's called, program that helps students go to post-secondary here in Ontario, they have a setup with the social assistance program where as of the early 2000s, it was allowed that you could go to school, because before that they wouldn't even let you, which was ridiculous. But you can only accept so much. So in this particular semester's example, in order to accept my full grants, they're deducting me over $370 a month for the months that I'm in school, because even though they're grants, and even though it's to pay for my schooling, they're counting it as income. And the only thing I'm doing with it, other than paying for my schooling, whatever little bit is left, is paying off the debt that I have because I don't have enough to live on. And I'm going to school because I want to get off the system. But, you know, it's not being made easy, we'll just say that. And then when it comes to budgeting, that really comes down to education and access to information, and access to resources. So it's definitely way easier to budget when you have a vehicle and you can drive to further locations that have lower prices, for one. And then it's also easier to budget when you have the education on how to do it. And that's just kind of touch and go, whether you're poor or not. Like if you were lucky enough to have an adult or a guardian or a parent that could teach you that. Um, and it just does seem to be a common trend that those who are in generational poverty, where their parents were poor and their parents, oftentimes they don't have a lot of knowledge in budgeting. But sometimes generational poverty can lead to a lot of knowledge in budgeting and making things spread out, because that's the only way they got by. So it depends on the person, is kind of what I want to say when it comes to poverty and budgeting. Some people will insist that they have sacrificed left, right, and center, and that it is possible that they were poor and they struggled, but they went without, and thus they were able to budget better and save and etc. But those people tend to not realize that in their own situation, like their mental health was in the state and their knowledge and education was in the state to allow for that. And the just genuine reality, as I've said in a lot of other videos discussing poverty and the impacts, it is hard on the mental health. It is genuinely traumatizing. And people can develop PTSD from growing up poor, and from that constant threat of, are my basic needs going to be covered? And so having that mental health struggle on top of, just trying to cover food and shelter, and that constant uncertainty can lead to a weaker mental health state that doesn't allow the resilience to make those sacrifices. Like, it takes work to say no when you're craving something sweet. And when you need to save it for your groceries, of course, that's the thought, and like that's what people consider reasonable. But what's reasonable and what we're capable of doing are sometimes just very two different things. And any person educated in mental health and psychology knows that it's not actually reasonable to condemn someone because their mental resources are limited. Like, help them. People can be helped into better mental health states, and then they can make better choices. Condemning them for being in a bad state doesn't help anything. It just makes things worse. So yeah, the all-around story is that budgeting comes down to like what you have available to you. If you live near places with lower price options, or if you live in an isolated area that only has expensive places, expensive stores. If you live in a city, you have a higher chance of having cheap grocery stores versus if you live in a small town. If you have a car, you have the option to go somewhere that has a cheaper grocery store or store, because the impoverished do at times manage to have vehicles. But when you don't have access to these things, there's increasingly more and more barriers to budgeting. If the very first one isn't that you don't have enough to provide your basic needs to begin with. So what is there left to budget? And it comes down to a lot of sacrificing that is really inhumane and unreasonable, where people like myself go without properly fitting clothes or properly fitting shoes, or like things with holes in them. My sweaters, my shoes, my clothes regularly have holes in them. I only have like one pair of shorts that fits, various things like that, because I don't have enough to go buy clothes. If I buy clothes for myself whatsoever, because like I need something to cover my ass or I'm going to get arrested for being nude, then I'm giving up some food or cleaning supplies or something else that I need. And it's that simple. Because I have to cover my hydro, I have to cover my rent, I have to cover my groceries, my cleaning supplies, my clothing, you name it. It's not as simple as a lot of people like to see it. And one thing I do just really want to end this with is that it's very possible that you have seen people that you feel or know to be on some form of social assistance who have not only budgeted poorly, but clearly spent absolutely terribly. Bought expensive items instead of the cheaper options, shopped for things like clothing when they can't afford their rent. These are bad decisions that happen among the impoverished quite a bit too. Again, partly because of education, partly because of bad mental health, and just partly because that's what they saw around them. You know, intergenerational bad decisions tend to carry on in the generations. But condemning these people for it doesn't help. And assuming that everyone's just like them also doesn't help, because there are a lot of different stories. There are a lot of different hardworking people who do their best and still find themselves unable to properly budget, unable to do as good as they could because they just don't have the resources that others do. I don't have a vehicle, so I do the best I can, and I do take the bus to go to the cheaper grocery store, but I live in the city, so I have that option. And I have the mental health to manage the bus. I've been in the state where I could not manage the bus. And so I can respect when people are like, I can't handle taking the bus to go to that other grocery store, so I need to shop at this one because it's within walking distance. Um, and so I guess if you really want to understand this issue, I just suggest doing a little research and empathizing with the reality that there are many different stories. And you might know some that you don't approve of, but there are others out there who don't fit that story. In the end, though, all in all, budgeting is basically impossible. Savings, no, never gonna happen. Or if you're saving money, like, then you're going without. Basically, yeah. So if you or someone you know has struggled with poverty and with budgeting and or debt in general, while being impoverished, please do comment below. Let me know how yours or their experience was, how you managed it, and you know, your thoughts on how you think other people could or couldn't manage it. Do keep in mind though the aspect of mental health, because that's just a part of everything we ever do, and you can't just ignore it. Or pretend, you know, because I'm fine, everyone else should be fine. The stories are a little bit more complex than that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the topic. And as always, do join me again next week or sometime soon, where I try again to share a little something I've learned or experienced in life.